shooting, they do this on purpose. They wait until you're shocked, sad, mad, whatever the case may be, and they look at you when you're in that state and they pounce. Because remember, the communist, it works to his advantage because he's such an anti-human, because he doesn't care about humanity, certainly not George Floyd, not cops, not anything really. He's able to dispassionately look at every single situation and analyze how it can help him. And the communists saw this terrible looking internet video and they immediately thought to themselves, wow, that's awesome. I mean, you have to understand that's what they were saying. All of them, all the scumbags. They didn't get sad, they didn't get mad. They looked at that guy dead and said, man, this is really good. And they pounced. And then they proceeded, well, to destroy the country. They did more to rip apart the United States of America than anything I've seen in probably my entire life. And of course, Barack Obama, yesterday on this 2-year anniversary, in the wake of this horrific Uvalde school shooting, had to somehow make it about George Floyd. And remember what I said yesterday, and I really mean this, I don't blame anybody for the divisions of this country as much as I blame Barack Obama. He was always that guy, always picking at all the scabs, pulling at every thread that holds this society together. And it's not as if he stopped that. He said, quote, in the aftermath of his murder, talking about George Floyd, a new generation of activists rose up to channel their anguish into organized action, launching a movement to raise awareness of systemic racism and the need for criminal justice and police reform. You see, while you stood by last year and you watched the horrific carnage taking place, 2 years ago, Barack Obama stood back and he watched everything, the looting, the burning, the death, and he said, this is exactly what we need. This is the ultimate in anti-Americanism. And the way, systemic racism. I hear that word so much. He says it again right here, systemic racism. You can read it again for yourself. Systemic racism. That's an interesting word. Certainly has been systemic racism against black people in the past. What do we have today in America? Let me see. Well, the new bill that Joe Biden and the Democrats passed, you know what that bill did? All that COVID money they were handing out to businesses, the bill did it in the law. It wasn't like a side thing. This was part of the law that passed the United States Congress and was signed into law by the President of the United States of America. You know what that bill did? It took all these business owners lining up for PPP money and going, white people, hey, whitey, to the back of the line with you. No money for you, whitey. Oh, you want a vaccine? Oh, you want monoclonal antibodies. Says here you're white. Sorry, whitey, those are for black people. We certainly do have some systemic racism going on in this country, don't we? Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Let's talk about George Floyd. I mean, I don't support police brutality, if you consider that being what that was at all, but let's stop with the insanity. We get this all the time where they will take something and they know it's got your attention and they will elevate things that shouldn't ever be elevated. George Floyd is a lifelong criminal and a drug dealer. And they've got a statue of the guy in New York City. He's got a statue. Remember in Washington, D.C., they actually plastered Black Lives Matter across the street. They just wrote it across the street. Black Lives Matter? That's a criminal organization made up of street communists. Remember, the Black Lives Matter people who got so popular 2 years ago in the wake of George Floyd's death, they're on camera stating they're Marxists. And all these businesses took your shareholder money and they started chucking gobs of it at Black Lives Matter. And we now know, what were they spending it on? Well, themselves. Weren't helping black people. Weren't fighting systemic racism. They were building mansions, paying off relatives, doing all the things violent street communists have always done. That's what they do. And that's what they're celebrating when they celebrate the anniversary of St. George Floyd's death. The Democratic Party, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, all of them chose to pounce on this thing. It was a sight to behold.
2 summers ago, in the middle of the pandemic, we saw protests across the nation, the likes of which you hadn't seen since the 1960s. They unified people of every race and generation. Athletes and sports leagues boycotted and postponed games. Companies and workers proclaimed Black Lives Matter. Students staged solidarity walkouts. From Europe to the Middle East to Asia to Australia, people saw their own fight for justice and equality, what we were trying to do.
Boy, it sure was uniting, wasn't it? Peaceful, very inspirational, except 570 of them were actually violent riots and 25 Americans are dead. Dead. They died in those. And look, you want to talk about the ultimate sky is green proof? Those riots 2 years ago, I'll never forget this moment as long as I live, did more to divide this country racially than anything I've ever seen before. I'll tell you, I think I've told you this before, we live in the suburbs of Texas. We're in the general Houston area. And so it's an extremely diverse racially and culturally area. It just is. And we don't discuss race in my house, or at least we never had up to that point in time. It was never discussed. My kids go to school with a bunch of kids of every different color. We're in the neighborhood, a bunch of people. We're always at neighborhood parties together. All their school friends are different colors. And it just is something that has never come up in our house. It's just not something we view as important. The color of your skin. It's just nothing we've talked about. And I'll never forget, it's crushing. In the middle of all this insanity after St. George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and white people suck and this and that, I'll never forget my youngest coming up to me and saying, he never mentioned race to me. He came up to me and said, "Dad, do black people hate us?" I'll never forget it. Of course, I sat down and told him, "No, son, we've got a bunch of scumbags out there taking it." I told him the who's who and the what's what, but he has eyes. He can see. These people are ripping the country apart. And do you remember the media? Do you remember it? Because I think people have forgotten. Do you remember how the media covered those violent, vile riots that were burning down American cities? In case you forgot, here's what they were saying then.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly.
That ain't a riot, what we're seeing right now in Minneapolis.
Any reasonable person would say we shouldn't be destroying other people's property, but these are not reasonable times.
But thank goodness for the looters, man.
And please, show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
What you're seeing behind me is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Do not get it twisted and think that, oh, this is something that has never happened before, and then this is so terrible, and where are we, and these savages and all of that. This is how this country was started.
Well, that's how the media covered it. So what are the results? How did it work out? I mean, it is the 2-year anniversary, right? Surely at this point in time, we can step back and analyze. How do we handle things? Well, here's how we handled things. We've talked to you before about how crime has been skyrocketing. Milwaukee's up 100%. 100%. Las Vegas, 45. Atlanta, 43. New Orleans, 35. Houston, 28. Baltimore, 26. Portland, 25. Minneapolis, 14. On and on and on. 133 police officers have been shot in 2022, and 20 of them were killed by gunfire. That's a 34% increase since 2020. And let me check my watch. It says May. In May, we've got a 34% increase in dead cops.
Jesse Kelly Breaks History, Vladimir Lenin, a new First TV exclusive special hosted by Jesse Kelly. Visit thefirsttv.com or download the First TV app to subscribe and start watching today.